did modern rational thought really begin? Most of us were taught to point straight to the Enlightenment.
Right, to figures like Bacon or Newton.
But what if that whole story is incomplete? What if the foundation of science, of empirical inquiry, was actually laid centuries earlier?
Deep in the heart of what we call the Dark Ages.
All because of a profound intellectual marriage.
And that is the incredibly provocative argument in the book we are diving into today. It
Yeah.
really does challenge centuries of assumptions.
It certainly does. But before we get too swept away, we need to be clear about how we approach books that try to redefine history on this scale.
Absolutely.
We believe that some books must be challenged. This critique uses, as appropriate, a step-by-step critical thinking framework that maps claims to evidence.
We also apply an intellectual framework, drawing on the works of Mortimer J. Adler.
And we use the Golden Rule and the U.S. Preamble to identify ethical asymmetries, and we conclude with a logical analysis for a balanced conclusion.
So our subject is Richard E. Rubenstein's Aristotle's Children: How Christians, Muslims, and Jews Rediscovered Ancient Wisdom and Illuminated the Dark Ages.
It's written for a general audience, and it makes these dense philosophical debates feel almost like a historical thriller.
It's very accessible, and its central thesis is incredibly ambitious.
Revolutionary, even. Rubenstein argues the rediscovery of Aristotle's works by medieval Christian, Muslim, and Jewish thinkers sparked this powerful marriage of faith and reason.
And he claims this synthesis didn't just illuminate the Middle Ages.
No, he says it actively prepared the groundwork for modern science, rational inquiry, and even pluralistic politics.
It's basically arguing there was a Renaissance hiding in plain sight.
Exactly. And for you listening right now, we should note up front, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
Okay, so let's get into the historical drama, because that's where the book really shines.
Rubenstein sets the stage in the 12th and 13th centuries. He focuses on these intellectual hotspots.
The new universities in Paris, and the incredibly vibrant centers of learning in Muslim Spain.
And the conflict really comes to a head in key moments, like the infamous 1277 condemnations in Paris.
Where the church authorities essentially tried to put the brakes on some of these new, dangerous Aristotelian ideas.
The book dramatizes all this with a fascinating cast of characters. You have Peter Abelard, whose logic kept getting him in trouble.
Then Thomas Aquinas, the great synthesizer, trying to make it all fit together.
And the radicals, like Sigurd of Brabant.
And crucially, you have figures from outside the Christian West, like the Muslim commentator Averroes and the Jewish philosopher Maimonides. It was a true intellectual battle.
So let's talk about the main disruptor here, Aristotle himself. What was so revolutionary about his thinking?
Well, think about the dominant philosophy of the early Middle Ages. It was mostly Platonic or Neoplatonic.
So the idea that the physical world is just a shadow of some higher spiritual reality.
Exactly. The real focus was on the eternal, the transcendent. But what Aristotle brings to the table is this absolute confidence that the world you can see and touch. It's real.
It's intelligible.
And it's knowable. Through systematic observation and logic, you can discover real causal truths about how things work. That empirical focus was just explosive.
So instead of just praying your way to understanding, you could observe your way there.
And this is how the book challenges that Dark Ages myth. It argues that when these churchmen got a hold of Aristotle's methods, they didn't just reject them.
They adopted them.
They adopted them. Rubenstein's big claim is that the Catholic leadership, through the universities, became an engine for this rational transformation.
Using Aristotelian logic to organize everything from theology to law.
But that created massive internal conflicts. The clashes over these ideas were intense.
We're not just talking about academic debates.
No, these were existential questions. Things like the eternity of the world, Aristotle argued for it, which directly contradicted the Genesis creation story.
Or natural causality. Does God intervene in every single event, or does nature run on its own set of rules?
And then there was the most controversial idea of all, double truth.
The idea that something could be true in philosophy, but false in theology.
The book makes a crucial point here. These 13th century fights didn't just go away. They set the stage for the later, more famous clashes between science and religion.
They really shaped the modern divide we still see today between secular knowledge and sacred wisdom.
That whole drama makes you wonder, though. How does Rubenstein actually prove such a massive point? When an author makes a claim this big, We have to look at the evidence.
So how does he build his case for this transformative marriage?
His strategy is very narrative, very biographical. He uses these vivid vignettes of key figures, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, and he combines them with these dramatic historical episodes.
Heresy trials, university disputes.
Exactly. And the marriage metaphor is central, framing Aquinas as the great counselor, trying to create harmony between the world of logic and the world of faith.
Okay, so we have these engaging stories, these documented conflicts. Using our critical thinking framework, how strong is that evidence, really?
Well, the concrete cases, the documented debates, the specific condemnations, they provide excellent narrative evidence that a real contested integration of Aristotle was absolutely happening.
That part is historical fact.
Undeniable. But the question isn't just if it happened. The question is what it caused.
Right. Is this one factor, the rediscovery of Aristotle, enough to explain the illumination of an entire era and the birth of modern science?
And that's where we hit a critical limitation, a point of potential overreach.
The leap is just too big.
It is. The leap from these specific university disputes to the huge claim that Aristotelianism alone illuminated the Dark Ages and laid the foundations for modern science, that edges toward overgeneralization.
Because modernity is so complex. You have institutional changes, economics, technology.
All these other factors that receive less systematic treatment in the book. When you focus so intensely on one philosophical thread, it's easy to make it seem like the only cause.
Which leads us perfectly into a deeper dive. We need to distinguish what Rubenstein argues, what he knows, what he helps us understand, and the wisdom he's offering.
And for those of you who appreciate these deeper analyses, remember to check out Mindful Moments. It's our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts, all to inspire reflection and rational thought.
Okay, so let's start with the contestable opinions. What are the big interpretive arguments in the book that aren't just straight facts?
I think the most notable one is how he frames the figures who broke away from this medieval synthesis.
You mean Martin Luther and Thomas Hobbes?
Exactly. He portrays them almost as the principal villains who came along and deliberately destroyed this beautiful faith-reason harmony that Aquinas had built.
That's a very powerful narrative, the betrayal of the great synthesis. But is it accurate?
It's a huge simplification. The critique points out this is a strong interpretive take, not a demonstrated fact. It sort of ignores all the massive structural forces changing Europe at that time and pins the blame on a couple of thinkers.
It also seems to put Aristotle on a pedestal, making his ideas the single most important force in history.
That's the other big interpretive opinion here. The claim that Aristotelianism itself is the primary leading force. It tends to overlook other powerful traditions.
Like the Augustinian spiritual tradition or technological and legal advancement?
And especially the rich Islamic, philosophical, and mystical traditions that were developing alongside, and not just as a prelude to the Christian West.
Okay, so let's pivot to the bedrock. What are the well-grounded facts, the genuine historical knowledge the book establishes?
It clearly establishes several key things. First, and this is so important, is that Aristotle's works re-entered the West largely through Arabic translations and commentaries.
The highway of knowledge ran through Muslim Spain and Sicily?
Not directly from ancient Greece. And second, it confirms that thinkers like Averroes and Maimonides were using Aristotle to interpret their own revelations before the Christian scholastics fully embraced him. Their work directly influenced what happened in Paris.
That cross-cultural transmission is maybe the most fascinating part of the story. Now, what about understanding? What systematic grasp does this book give us?
This is where it's most valuable. It gives you an integrated picture of the High Middle Ages. It connects metaphysics to theology, to law, to politics.
It helps you see why a debate about the eternity of the world wasn't just some dusty academic squabble.
It was existentially and politically charged. The entire structure of society was on the line.
And finally, wisdom. What's the long-range lesson Rubenstein is trying to offer us today?
His underlying message is really profound. It's that societies flourish when they maintain creative tension between rational inquiry and spiritual meaning. He argues that the modern split between knowledge and wisdom is the root of our current science versus religion conflicts.
He's championing that medieval attempt at synthesis.
He is. And that model of synthesis brings us to a crucial point of critique. We have to look at the ethical balance and the logical structure of his argument.
Let's quickly recap the core argument pattern.
It's straightforward. 1. Aristotle provides confidence in the natural world. 2. His works enter the Abrahamic traditions, creating new institutions like universities. 3. This synthesis creates a medieval renaissance that anticipates modernity.
Okay, so where does that narrative logic start to overreach? What are the potential fallacies?
The first risk is post hoc reasoning. Just because modernity came after the recovery of Aristotle doesn't mean Aristotle caused modernity.
Correlation isn't causation.
Exactly. Historians have to acknowledge countless other factors.
And what about that hero-villain framing we talked about? Aquinas versus Luther and Hobbes.
That pushes toward a false dichotomy. It presents a choice. You're either with the unifying Aristotelians or you're a destructive critic. But in reality, later thinkers were building new forms of empiricism, not just tearing down the old ones.
I also noticed the book paints in very broad strokes, Aristotelian eras versus Platonic eras.
And that's the risk of a hasty generalization. It glosses over centuries of complexity, generalizing about entire cultures based on the dominant philosophy in one city.
And what about the radicals? Seeger of Brabant and the double truth idea.
Rubenstein's treatment of them, while dramatic, risks being a bit of a straw man. He can make it sound like they were simply arguing for two contradictory truths, which might misrepresent the very sophisticated and often pious way they were actually testing the limits of reason.
This question of nuance leads us straight to the ethical dimension. We need to look at this through the lens of reciprocal moral regard.
And this is an area where the book has a significant shortcoming. The critique identifies a real ethical imbalance in the narrative.
The title promises a story of Christians, Muslims, and Jews.
But the structure really foregrounds the Christian scholastics. Islamic and Jewish thinkers like Averroes and Maimonides are often treated primarily as sources, as conveyors of Aristotle.
Not as co-equal architects of their own rational religious syntheses.
Precisely. Their own monumental achievements within their own traditions are downplayed. A stronger ethical balance would give symmetrical attention to their institutional contexts, not just frame them as a bridge to the Latin West.
And if the Catholic Church is the main protagonist of this story,
Then the ethical balance demands we also confront the ways its authority both enabled and suppressed inquiry.
we can't forget the condemnations, the persecution of thinkers who went too far.
Absolutely. To frame the church mostly as a progressive protagonist is to gloss over the times it actively restricted rational thought when it conflicted with dogma.
So after all that, what's the takeaway for you, the listener? Let's quickly summarize the strengths and the limits.
The major strength is clear, compelling storytelling. It makes these remote figures feel alive. And critically, it does a great job challenging that old myth of modern science simply rebelling against a dark, ignorant medieval church.
And the key limitations.
The tendency to overprivilege Western Christianity in the narrative, the reliance on historically blunt hero-villain contrasts, and asserting rather than proving the direct causal link from medieval thought to modern culture.
This brings us to the practical application. The difference between the information you get and the understanding you take away.
The information is the documented facts. The transmission of texts through Muslim Spain, the specific university disputes. The understanding is Rubenstein's powerful, if flawed, big story. The medieval attempt to forge a synthesis of reason and spirituality as a model for today.
The book really does offer rich material for contemporary thought. It speaks to science versus religion debates, to interfaith dialogue.
And to the ongoing search for a civic ethic that honors both rational inquiry and the equal dignity of all people.
Ultimately, Aristotle's Children is best seen not as the final word,
but as a stimulating, imperfect, and really thought-provoking case study in how traditions wrestle with reason.
And we should acknowledge that the comprehensive critique framework we applied here was generated from a systematic and precise set of scholarly sources designed for this kind of in-depth analysis.
Which brings us right back to where we started. If the so-called Dark Ages were illuminated by a marriage of reason and faith, what new synthesis must we forge today to avoid a modern-day divorce between knowledge and wisdom?
That is the provocative thought we'll leave you with.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis.
Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.